I'm Marcus Cole, and welcome to Feral Soul Stories. Tonight, I want to tell you about a retired police officer named Thomas Reed, dying of pancreatic cancer in a Montana hospice, with maybe 3 days left to live. His partner, a German shepherd named Chief, had passed 6 years ago and was buried at Thomas's remote mountain cabin, 200 miles away. Thomas had no family to speak of, just a room with a window and some photographs on a nightstand. And then, at 2:47 in the morning, on Thomas's final night on this earth, the hospice's security cameras picked up something in the parking lot. A wolf, gray calm, 95 pounds, with a distinctive white marking across its chest. It sat facing Thomas's window. It didn't pace. It didn't howl. It just sat there, still as stone, and it stayed until dawn. Thomas died peacefully 3 hours later. Here's the question that has haunted everyone who has ever heard this story. That white chest marking, the one on the wolf, was identical to Chief's. And wildlife experts, after reviewing the footage, determined that the wolf had traveled from the exact direction of Thomas's cabin. Its age, its movement patterns, its known territory, all of it matched a cub that had been found injured near that cabin 6 years ago. The same week Chief died, a cub Thomas had secretly fed and nursed through his grief in the long, silent months after he lost his partner, never telling a single soul. How did the wolf know? How did it find him? 200 miles. A different world. In a life. And still, something came. I'm going to tell you everything I know about Thomas Reed. Everything I pieced together from the hospice staff, from his neighbors up in the mountains, from the wildlife researcher who spent weeks trying to make sense of what those cameras recorded. And by the time I'm done, I think you'll understand why this story has never fully left me. To understand the end of this story, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the man Thomas Reed was before illness stripped everything else away. He joined the Missoula County Sheriff's Department at 22 years old in 1980. The kind of young man who arrived at work early and stayed late, who took the job seriously in ways that his supervisors sometimes found slightly unnerving. He believed in things: duty, order, the idea that a good officer could hold the line between chaos and everything decent. His colleagues liked him, but found it hard to get close to him. Thomas had a formality, a precision about him that kept people at a respectful distance. He didn't really come alive until Chief. The German shepherd arrived in Thomas's life in 1991, when Thomas was 33 and had recently been assigned to the K-9 unit. Chief was 18 months old, already trained, already serious, already the kind of dog who looked at the world with focused amber eyes and seemed to be taking notes. Thomas drove to the training facility in Billings to collect him on a Tuesday morning in early March. The sky low and gray with the particular kind of winter that Montana holds on a long past its welcome. He had done his reading, completed the required courses, been briefed by the trainer on Chief's capabilities and temperament. He was prepared. What he wasn't prepared for was the moment Chief looked at him. The trainer led the dog out on a leash, and Chief sat, precise, alert, professional. And then he turned his head and looked directly at Thomas. Not at the trainer, not at the building, at Thomas. And he held that gaze for a long moment with those amber eyes that seemed to contain something ancient and knowing. Thomas told the trainer it was almost unsettling. The trainer laughed and said that meant Chief had chosen him. Dogs like Chief, he explained, sometimes just decided. And once they decided, that was that. Thomas and Chief worked together for 14 years. 14 years of patrol shifts and tracking operations and drug interdictions and search and rescue calls that took them into the mountains in the middle of the night. 14 years of the kind of wordless communication that develops between a handler and a working dog. The tilt of an ear that meant something was wrong. The particular quality of stillness that meant Chief was onto his scent. Thomas learned to read Chief the way other men learned to read weather or water. They saved each other's lives twice. The first time was a November night in 2002, when Thomas was tracking a suspect through the Helena National Forest and slipped on ice at the edge of a ravine. Chief caught the sleeve of his jacket in his teeth, 78 pounds of dog bracing against the pull of 190 pounds of man, and held on. Held on until Thomas could get his footing. His arm was bruised for weeks. He never filed a report about the incident. The second time was quieter, slower, harder to name. It was 2003, and Thomas had been dealing with what he refused to call depression, but was, in fact, exactly that, a grinding hollowness that had settled in after his mother died and his brief marriage ended, and the work that had always been enough suddenly wasn't. He found himself sitting in his patrol car at the end of shifts, not able to make himself drive home. He found himself staring at the ceiling at 3 o'clock in the morning, feeling as though the room had no air. He said nothing to anyone. Chief knew. Chief began waking him from sleep before the ceiling staring could fully take hold, nudging his face with a cold nose until Thomas sat up, until the act of caring for another creature pulled him back for whatever edge he'd been approaching. Chief began sitting against his legs in the evenings, pressed close, warm, deliberate, in the way that dogs do when they sense something that humans are trying not to acknowledge. Thomas started going outside more, started cooking actual meals, started leaving the curtains open to let in the morning light. He credited none of this to anyone or anything. But he knew. In 2005, they both retired on the same day. Thomas had put in his 30 years. Chief, at 15, had a heart that was beginning to fail. The veterinarian was gentle about it, but honest. Thomas took the retirement paperwork and Chief's medical records on the same afternoon and drove the 200 miles north to his mountain cabin, the one he'd bought 30 years earlier, and spent weekends of vacations building into something that felt, more than anywhere else, like home. He had 32 acres of pine forest and a creek that ran hard in spring. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles down the road. He had planned to hike with Chief in the mornings. He had planned to fish. He had planned to finally read the stack of books that had been accumulating on his nightstand for a decade. Chief died 11 months later, on a Tuesday in early March, the same month and roughly the same week of the year that Thomas had first brought him home. He died on the rag rug by the wood stove, which is where he had slept every night for 14 years. Thomas was sitting with him. He had been sitting with him for the better part of 3 days, as Chief's breathing slowed and the gaps between breaths lengthened. He held Chief's head in his lap when it happened. He sat there for a long time afterward in the silence of the cabin, listening to the creak and the wind, feeling the warmth go out of the room. He buried Chief in the meadow behind the cabin, under the old spruce tree where they used to sit in the evenings. He didn't mark the grave with anything elaborate, just a flat granite stone he carried from the creek bed, heavy enough that it took both hands. He set it at the head of the mound and smoothed the disturbed earth with his palms, and then stood there for a while with his hands at his sides. He was 61 years old, and he had never felt so thoroughly alone. What happened the weeks after Chief died, Thomas never told anyone directly. What his neighbor Margaret Okafor pieced together, from the few things he said over the years, for what she noticed when she drove up to check on him, was this: Thomas fell into a grief that he didn't know how to navigate. He had grieved before, had lost his mother and his partner in his marriage, but this was different. Chief had been the through line, the constant, the presence that organized everything else. Without him, the cabin felt enormous in a way that no amount of books or firewood could address. He started leaving food out. He didn't plan it, didn't decide it. He found himself one evening placing a bowl of water outside the back door. Then a few nights later, leaving some scraps of cooked chicken on the porch railing. It was the kind of thing a person does when they're trying not to notice what they're doing. He told himself it was for birds. Or squirrels. Something. The first time he actually saw the wolf cub, it was late October, 6 weeks, maybe 7, after Chief died. Thomas had been in the barn checking the water line when he heard a sound near the woodpile. He went still the way you do when you're not sure what you're hearing. The sound came again. Small, thin, not quite a cry. He found the cub wedged between 2 split logs, maybe 8 weeks old. One front leg held awkwardly. Not broken, he determined later, but badly strained. The cub was gray with a white chest marking that made Thomas stop breathing for a moment because it was so similar in its placement and its shape to Chief's white blaze. He stood there looking at the cub. The cub looked back at him with yellow eyes that were enormous in its small face, full of the particular wild wariness of a creature that has not yet decided whether fear or curiosity is the correct response to the world. Thomas went inside and got the towel he used to clean his boots and came back and wrapped the cub in it and brought it into the mudroom. He didn't tell anyone. He told himself it was temporary. He would nurse the leg, make sure the cub could walk properly, and release it. That was the plan. He was a former law enforcement officer. He knew perfectly well that raising a wolf was illegal without permits. He knew the protocols. He was going to follow them. He fed the cub by hand for the first 3 days, warm broth, small pieces of meat, a little water from an eyedropper. The cub ate with an intensity that Thomas found he appreciated. No ambivalence, no hesitation. Hungry, therefore eating. Injured, therefore accepting help. The directness of it was something Thomas understood. The leg healed within 2 weeks. The cub, in those 2 weeks, did not become tame exactly, but it became accustomed. It would hear Thomas's footsteps in the mudroom and come to the door of its box. It learned the sound of the refrigerator. It began sleeping deeply instead of in the fitful, vigilant way it had slept the first few nights, ears swiveling even in unconsciousness. On the 14th day, Thomas carried the cub to the tree line behind the cabin and set it down in the snow. He stepped back. The cub sat for a moment, orienting itself. It walked forward into the trees. It paused once at the edge of the shadows and looked back. Those yellow eyes, that white chest, and then it was gone. Thomas stood there until his feet went numb. He went back inside. He put the box away. He washed the towel and folded it and put it in the linen closet. He told himself that was the end of it. But he left food out that night, and the night after that, and for the next 2 months until the ground froze solid, and then through the spring and into the summer, until gradually, so gradually he almost couldn't track the transition, the food stopped disappearing. Life moved on the way it does. He sold some timber from the back 40. He drove down to Missoula twice a year to have lunch with his old partner from the department. He got older. The cabins settled around him. The years passed in the way they pass when there is no urgency to measure them. And now he was 68 years old, and he was dying. The pancreatic cancer had been diagnosed 14 months before that final night. Stage 4 by the time they found it, which is how it usually goes with pancreatic cancer. It's quiet right up until it isn't. Thomas took the diagnosis with the same precision he'd brought to everything else in his life. He organized his affairs. He signed the paperwork. He arranged for Margaret Okafor to manage the property. He said goodbye to the cabin on a Thursday morning in September, standing in a meadow for a while near the granite stone under the old spruce, and then he drove himself down to the Pinebrook Hospice in Missoula and checked in. The staff at Pinebrook noted in those first weeks that Thomas was a private patient. Polite, cooperative, not difficult, but private. He had a few visitors. Margaret came twice a month. His former partner from the department drove up in October. Mostly, though, he was alone. He read. He looked out the window. On good days, he walked slowly down the corridor and back. He never complained. He was given the corner room on the 2nd floor, which had a window facing north toward the mountains, toward the direction of his cabin. The staff didn't know that was why he'd requested it. By the last week of his life, Thomas was sleeping most of the day. The hospice physician, Dr. Adiz Nwosu, a quiet, thoughtful woman from Lagos who had been working in palliative care for 20 years, told the nursing staff that she expected Thomas had perhaps 72 hours remaining, more likely 48. His body was shutting down in the orderly way that the body does when it has made its arrangements. His breathing was slow. His pain was managed. He was not agitated. She stopped by his room at 11 o'clock that Tuesday evening and found him awake, which surprised her. His eyes were clear. "Is there anything you need?" she asked. "Anyone I should call?" Thomas thought about this for a moment. "No," he said. "There's no one left who needs to know." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that Dr. Nwosu wrote down afterward because she found it strange and also because she had the sense that he wanted it remembered. "I've been thinking about a wolf cub," he said. "I helped one once years ago. I've been wondering what became of it." Dr. Nwosu didn't know what to say to that. She told him she hoped it had done well, and she meant it. Thomas nodded and closed his eyes. She left him at 11:20 and went back to her rounds. At 2:47 in the morning, the night staff member at the front desk, a young man named Carlos, heard what he initially thought was a dog scratching at the exterior door, the sound of nails on the glass panel, brief, almost tentative. He looked up from his monitor and saw nothing. He went back to his work. 30 seconds later, the sound came again. He walked to the door and looked out. The parking lot was lit by the amber sodium lights that hospices tend to use, warm, not harsh, designed not to disturb patients who might be looking out at the night. In that amber light, sitting on the pavement perhaps 8 feet from the entrance, was a wolf. It was sitting upright, the way a dog sits when it is waiting for something specific. Its fur was gray and thick with the winter coat of an animal that spends its life outdoors. It had a white marking on its chest, distinctive, almost star-shaped, that caught the light. Carlos stood very still for a moment. Then he backed away from the door and called the supervisor. By the time the night supervisor, Brenda Park, arrived, the wolf had moved. She found it, after a few minutes of searching, outside the north-facing window of the corner room on the second floor, standing below the window on the frozen ground. Looking up, Brenda was a practical woman. She called Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, got an after-hours answering service, left a message. She called the non-emergency police line, reported the presence of a large wolf at the facility, was told someone would check on it if they could. She checked on Thomas, who was sleeping quietly, his breathing slow and even, and she stood at his window and looked out. The wolf was still there. It had settled from standing into sitting. It was facing the building. It was not pacing. It was not vocalizing. It was simply present in the way that certain large animals are present, fully occupying the space, giving nothing away, requiring nothing. Brenda went back to the nurse's station and drank a cup of coffee and watched the security feed. The wolf sat. She checked on Thomas at 3:30. Still sleeping. The wolf sat. She checked at 4:15. Thomas sleeping. Wolf sitting. She checked at 5 o'clock. Thomas's breathing had changed, shallower, the small hesitation between breaths that she had learned to recognize after 20 years in hospice work. She stayed with him. The wolf was there until exactly 6:17, when the sky in the east began to lighten from black to the gray-violet of early winter dawn. The security footage showed it standing, stretching once in the way wolves do, a full-body arc from nose to tail, and then walking across the parking lot to the road and turning north. It did not look back. By 6:20, it was gone. Thomas Reed died at 9:08 that morning. Dr. Nwosu was with him, and Brenda Park, and a nurse named Elena who had come on the morning shift. His breathing simply stopped. He died in the way that people die when they have made their peace, without struggle, without visible pain, as if sleep had simply continued a little further than usual. His face, Elena said afterward, was completely at rest. Dr. Nwosu signed the death certificate and stood for a moment at the window, looking north. She thought about what Thomas had said the night before, about the wolf cub, about wondering what became of it. The wildlife researcher came 2 weeks later. Her name was Dr. Rachel Goodwin, a wolf ecologist at the University of Montana who had spent 15 years tracking the movements and family structures of wolf packs throughout the western part of the state. She had been contacted by Carlos, who had written up a careful account of what he'd seen and sent it to the university on a kind of impulse, uncertain why, but feeling that someone who studied these things should know about it. And she came to Pine Brook on a gray November afternoon with a laptop full of data. She spent several hours with the security footage. She was careful and methodical about it, the way scientists are, making notes and measuring and not saying anything definitive until she had looked at everything twice. What she told Brenda Park that afternoon, sitting in the small conference room off the main corridor, was this. The wolf in the footage was a male, approximately 6 years old, based on size and movement patterns. His territory, as established by her research team's tracking data, was centered on the mountains north of Missoula, in the same general region as Thomas Reed's cabin. The white chest marking was unusual and distinctive, the kind of genetic trait that appears occasionally in gray wolves and tends to be consistent throughout an individual's life. 6 years ago, in the autumn, her team had documented a lone wolf cub in the same area, injured, separated from its pack, estimated at 8 to 10 weeks old. They had cataloged it in their records as a potential orphan. That cub had never been found again, which typically meant one of two things. It had died, or it had been taken in. Given that it had subsequently turned up in their tracking data as a healthy adult 3 years later, the second option seemed likely. The footage showed the wolf had arrived at Pine Brook from the north. He had not come through the city. The tracks, where they were visible in the frozen mud at the property's edge, came from the open ground north of the facility. He had traveled, by Rachel's best estimate, somewhere between 180 and 220 miles. He had arrived at approximately 2:45 in the morning. He had sat outside the window of a dying man's room for 3.5 hours. And then he had left. Rachel was quiet for a moment after laying all of this out. Is there any scientific explanation? Brenda asked. There's several possible explanations, Rachel said carefully. Wolves have a navigational capacity we don't fully understand. They can detect chemical signals, scent markers, over remarkable distances. If Thomas Reed had any personal items or clothing here that carried the scent of the cabin, of the property, that's one possible pathway. Wolves also have documented associations with human territories that they've been exposed to during their development. If this wolf spent time near Thomas's cabin as a cub. She stopped. If that wolf spent time near his cabin, she said again, more quietly, then the connection between this animal and Thomas Reed is 6 years old. And whatever sent him here, 200 miles in the middle of a November night, she looked at her notes. She looked out the window. I don't have a complete scientific explanation for that. Brenda drove up to Thomas's cabin the following weekend, with the keys she'd been given by the estate. She parked in the yard and walked around the property for a while, through the meadow, and past the old spruce with the granite stone at its base. She found, near the tree line at the back of the property, an area of flattened snow where something large had been lying. Recently, based on the freshness of it. The impression was the size and shape of a large dog, or a wolf. She stood there for a while in the cold. The mountains were very clear against the pale winter sky. She has told me she doesn't know what to think about it exactly. She said it doesn't really matter what you call it, what framework you put around it. What matters, she said, is that a man who spent his last weeks alone in a room, who thought there was no one left who needed to know, had someone come for him at the end. Something traveled 200 miles through the Montana winter to sit outside his window until dawn. She thinks Thomas knew it was there. She has no evidence of this. But in 30 years of hospice work, she said, you develop a sense for these things. She thinks he felt it. She thinks that's why he was peaceful. If stories like this one touch you, stories about bonds that science can't quite explain, about love that travels distances it has no reason to cross, I want you to consider subscribing to Feral Soul Stories by Marcus Cole. Every week, I bring you another story from the edges of what we think we understand about the connection between humans and wild animals. Join our community of people who believe these bonds are real and sacred and worth knowing about. I want to tell you something about the nature of grief because I think it matters here. When Thomas Reed lost Chief, he did what people do when they're grieving and don't know how to grieve. He found a direction for his care. He fed a wolf cub that couldn't walk. He held it in a towel. He watched it eat, watched it sleep, watched it heal. He did all the things he had done for 14 years with his partner. He showed up, he paid attention, he provided. And when the cub was ready, he let it go. He never told anyone about those weeks. I've thought about why, and I think I understand it. It wasn't a story he wanted analyzed. He wasn't looking for credit or documentation. It was simply what happened in the months after he lost Chief in the long quiet of that mountain winter. He met a creature that needed something he could provide, and he provided it. That's all. The simplicity of it was, I think, the point. Grief works on us in strange ways. It looks for outlets, for places to put the energy of love that has nowhere left to go. Thomas poured his into a wolf cub that showed up at his woodpile with a strained leg and yellow eyes. And then the wolf grew up and found its territory and lived its life in the mountains north of Missoula. And Thomas moved on too, to the slow years, to the illness, to the room with a window facing north. But here's what I keep coming back to. That wolf remembered. Not as a human remembers, not with narrative or nostalgia, but with something. With whatever it is that sends an animal 200 miles through the dark on a Tuesday night in November. With whatever it is that makes a creature that has no obligation to anyone, no reason to travel, no way of knowing what it will find, make the journey anyway. Dr. Rachel Goodwin told me that in all her years of studying wolves, she has documented behavior that most people would find surprising if they knew about it. Wolves return to places they have been cared for. They maintain associations with specific humans across years of separation. They have a capacity for recognition and loyalty that we tend to attribute only to domesticated animals, as if wildness and fidelity were somehow incompatible. They are not. She's been watching wolves long enough to know that they are not. Thomas Reed spent 46 years in law enforcement, 30 of them working alongside a dog who knew him better than any human did. He spent his last years alone in the mountains, not because he was unhappy, but because solitude was what he understood. He spent his final weeks in a room in Missoula, waiting for the end with the quiet patience that had characterized his entire life. He wondered what became of the wolf cub. I think the wolf cub answered. There's a photograph on the wall of the nurse's station at Pinebrook Hospice now. Brenda Park printed it from the security footage. The clearest frame, 2:51 in the morning, the wolf sitting in the amber light with its white chest marking visible, facing the north wall of the building, perfectly still. Someone wrote beneath it, in neat handwriting, "He came." No name, no explanation, just that. The staff at Pinebrook see it every day. New nurses ask about it, and Brenda tells them the story, and most of them say something like what you'd expect, that it's remarkable, that it's beautiful, that it makes them feel something they can't quite name. One of the night nurses, a young man from Minnesota named Joel, who is skeptical by nature and proud of it, told me he looks at that photograph every time he starts to shift, not because he believes in anything supernatural, but because it reminds him that his patients are not alone, that they exist in connections that extend further than a family tree or a visitation log, into the world beyond the building's walls, into the mountains and the years and the long, uncatalogued history of small kindnesses given and received. Thomas Reed fed a wolf cub from his hand in the winter of grief. He watched it walk back into the wilderness. He went on with his life. And when his life was ending in a room 200 miles from the mountains he loved, something walked out of those mountains and sat outside his window until dawn. Some bonds don't need to be explained. They just need to be witnessed. If this story has stayed with you, if it has given you something to think about tonight, I'd ask you to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the remarkable, often inexplicable connections between humans and the wild world, please subscribe to Feral Soul Stories by Marcus Cole. Come back every week. There are more stories where this one came from. Real ones. Ones that will stay with you. Tell me in the comments. Do you believe animals carry the memory of love across years and distance? I read every one. I want to know what you think. These aren't just animal stories. They're about what we leave in the world when we act with kindness. About the things we set in motion without knowing it. A bowl of water on a porch, a towel around a shivering creature, a hand extended in the dark. About the way care, given freely and without expectation, travels in directions we can't predict and returns to us in ways we never planned for. Thomas Reed didn't know what he was starting that October evening at his woodpile. He was just a man who had lost his partner and found something small and hurt and looking at him with yellow eyes. He helped it. That was all. He helped it, and then he let it go. And 6 years later, something came back through 200 miles of Montana winter to sit outside his window until the sky turned gray. He came. Welcome to Feral Soul Stories. Real emotions, untamed hearts.